Good afternoon. Salam, salam, khosh amadin. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a very good sign of interest in this topic. It matters. All of you who are here, all of those of you who are joining us online. My name is Lise Doucette. I'm the BBC's Chief International Correspondent, and I'm honored to be here on this part of this distinguished panel. And the topic, of course, it's very catchy. Tehran and Trump. What's next for Iran's power in the Middle East? And right on cue, President Trump made sure it was in our headlines. As you saw on Saturday, just as we were wondering whether Iran would ever be in the headlines again, President Trump launched a series of airstrikes against Yemen. It could just be the start. He made it absolutely clear in the way he does with capital letters that there was hell to pay if the Houthis did not stop their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. And he made it absolutely clear that he holds Iran responsible. So is this an opening salvo about those talks that President Trump has made it clear he would like to hold with the Islamic Republic? I'm sure all of you here, I'm sure you follow Iran closely. President Trump has sent another letter to the Supreme Leader, again in his characteristic style, negotiate or else. There was another story in the news today that many of you may have seen, that the opposition leader and former speaker, Mehdi Karoubi, has been released at least from house arrest. Is that something significant? Because I think in today's discussion, we would like to focus on what is happening inside Iran, what is happening across the region, with what Iran has called his axis of resistance, the so-called ring of fire. A lot of the fires in that ring are no longer burning, or at least not burning so brightly as they used to. And we want to be able to end our discussion today of about an hour with a better understanding of what President Trump and what other Western countries, including Britain, is looking for. So I'm delighted that there will be the people here with I have the questions and they have the answers, and we want your questions as well. Professor Milani, Mohsin Milani, very happy to have you here, especially because President Trump may have put Iran in the news, but you actually, especially for this session, managed to write a whole book on the topic so that it has come out just before this session. It's called Iran's Rise and Rivalry in the Middle East with the United States. We could give this whole session over to you. Professor Milani is the founding and the executive director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of Florida. Next to him is Dr. Sanam Vakil, who's the director of the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House. So a familiar face and voice and wisdom to all of us. And last but not least, Sir John Soares, who has had a very long and distinguished career, many appointments as ambassador across the Middle East, also at the United Nations. And of course, he was the head of Britain's Secret Service, MI6. And now he advises in the private sector. And as you see, he also brings his wisdom here. I thought it would be useful, before we focus specifically on this issue of Trump and Tehran and what really is possible and desirable, is a better understanding, so we have a shared understanding in this room about Iran now, because as you know, it's a very complex political structure, Iran in the region, and then more a little bit about where Western allies. Sanam Vakil, could you, looking at it through the prism of Iran has got this letter, President Trump wants to negotiate. We understand Iran is weakened, perhaps internally and externally. How do you see Iran now?
Thanks for bringing us together, Lise. And of course, this is very timely. Also a week where Iranians will be celebrating Persian New Year's. We would like to say that we curated it, but sometimes just calendars align, and we're lucky to have such distinguished guests with us today, Professor Milani and Sir John. Looking at Iran's domestic landscape, I think it's important to consider that Iran has been certainly through a very difficult year last year. I would caveat that and say that Iran has been going through a difficult year almost every year. And Chatham House asks me to write about Iran quite frequently, and I always say the same thing. Iran is facing a legitimacy crisis. Iran is facing an economic crisis. And
yet it survives.
And yet it's continuing to survive. What analysts like myself are not great at doing is predicting the future. That's not what we do, but we can analyze the conditions on the ground. Iran last year was certainly setback, and we'll talk about that. But domestically, there were some maybe openings, and Iran has seen the death of the previous president, Ebrahim Raisi, who was a conservative, a hardliner, a hawk, if you will. And with his death came a new election. And elections, many people don't think matter in authoritarian states. But in Iran, domestic politics is relevant because it builds openings for consensus in the system. Iran is heavily factionalized as a state. And President Pezeshkian, who has now been brought into office, has created a cabinet that is a bit more balanced, that brings together conservatives and pragmatists within the system, and came into power articulating a need for sanctions relief. And for many months, held that factional system together with the support of Iran's supreme leader. Iran needs sanctions relief because now, since 2018, it has been under unprecedented sanctions. The economy is in dire straits. People continue to make it by barely. The middle class is shrinking. Poverty is increasing significantly. And this is, of course, putting immense pressure on ordinary people. We saw protests 2 years ago, the Women Life Freedom protests. They were brutally repressed. Repression still exists in Iran. And yet there have been very minor openings. The release of Mehdi Karoubi is something to celebrate. Iran's hardline parliament passed the veiling bill to police and impose fines on women for flouting the hijab. The president pushed that aside. At the same time, the government and society are in a tug and pull about social restrictions. And that very much continues. There's an environmental crisis in Iran. I think that is a huge one that we don't ever have time to talk about. And over the top of all of this, I would say the system in Iran is in transition. You know where it's in transition because we've been also saying that for far too long. The supreme leader is aging. There's factional competition between the elite. And there will be a point, and this is a certainty, that he will move on from this life. And that will present a really important opening for either a new supreme leader to emerge or for the system to change, either with constitutional reform or some other form of change. And I think all of this is putting a lot of pressure on the individuals within that system. They're competing for the future and under pressure economically and under pressure from President Trump, with a lot of tweets and letters being delivered. Letters have been going back and forth between the US and Iran since the Ahmadinejad days. This is a 20-year saga or some sort of soap opera that we've been living through. We are seeing them, pre-negotiate. Will they get to the actual negotiating table? It's hard to say, but there's certainly a lot at stake for Iran in this year. And I think that's why the system and the supreme leader and the people around him are being very cautious because they want to avoid strikes. They're seeking sanctions relief and trying to preserve, ultimately, the Islamic Republic.
Competing for the future, very catchy phrase. You should have a Chatham House paper on that one too. Is there a brief answer just to the question, in this transition, who is really literally calling the shots? Everyone wonders whether the ailing supreme leader is he the one really making the decisions, or have the IRGC ascended in terms of their influence?
Look, the IRGC is influential, but it is still part of the system as an economic player, a security player, and a military player, and they have deep ties and connectivity with Iran's supreme leader. They're beholden to each other. They came up together through the ranks. So in brief, I would say that the supreme leader is still calling the shots, believe it or not. And this is a system that works best when it's in consensus. So the way decision making is made, it's tossed around through institutions, it's tossed around in the public domain, and it's tossed around on foreign policy issues in the Supreme National Security Council, where all of the relevant players come together, debate, and put forward recommendations.
Good, thank you. I'm sure we'll discuss this a bit further. To you, Professor Milani, how hot is the fire in the region, that ring of fire?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to Dr. Sana Vakil for helping me come to London to make a few remarks about Iran's position in the Middle East. The convention of wisdom in Washington and in London today is that Iran has become a weakened, wounded state. And therefore, the conclusion is, and that is pushed by some Middle Eastern powers, the implication is that because Iran is wounded, therefore we need to finish the job, using an American expression. Finishing the job means either bombing Iranian nuclear facilities or bombing Iran's nuclear facilities plus its military infrastructure, or it could also mean regime change. The problem is that this assumption, in my judgment, is more of a feeling than a correct assumption. My view is that Iran's power reached its peak in 2020 with the assassination of the IRGC commander, Qasem Soleimani. That power plateaued and then began to slowly go down. And then after the terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas, that decline accelerated. Iran by no means is powerless to retaliate against external aggression. To put it in the most easily understandable framework, as a professor, we always use numbers, A, B, C, D, E, we grade people. So from a scale of 10, 0 to 10, 0 being least powerful, 10 being most powerful, I would say in Iranian context, Iran in 2020 was 10, and Iran today is either 5 or 6. Its power has significantly diminished. Most important part of this decline is the overthrow of Assad's regime. The overthrow of Assad regime was to Iran what the Iranian Revolution was to the United States in 1979, because Iran lost its most important state actor in the Middle East. Now, Hezbollah has been weakened, but definitely is not out. For a guerrilla organization, as the late Henry Kissinger remarked once, for a guerrilla organization not to be decisively defeated is victory. Hezbollah is not being decisively defeated. Its military power has diminished, but it is still a popular force. It represents a significant population of Lebanese, and it is an indigenous force. Moreover, it has many options. It can go back to the political arena and play an important role in Lebanese politics, but most importantly, it can even revive its military capabilities slowly. And then it can also form an alliance with Amal, another Shia organization. Now, Hamas has been completely weakened. And I have to tell you that in my assessment of Iran's regional policy, Iran never counted on Hamas as a major force to retaliate against Israel. It was essentially Hezbollah and its own missile and drone activities. So the decline of Hamas, I think, is a plus for the Islamic Republic. The Houthis have been weakened, but they definitely are not out. That's why we're bombing the hell out of them today. And the Iraqi militias are not out either. So yes, Iran has been weakened, but not out. The key point is that Iranian position today might have been weakened has been weakened in terms of its reliance on non-state actor. But there are positive signs, positive developments that compensate for that loss. What are they? First and foremost is that Iran has much better relationship today with Saudi Arabia, with United Arab Emirates, with Arab countries, with Russia, with China than it did in 2020. That is on the plus side. Moreover, Iran in 2020 did not have a stockpile of 60% uranium. It does now. In other words, its nuclear advancement is much more impressive today than it was a few years ago. Finally, we keep talking about Iranian position hasn't been weakened. Has the United States position and Israel position also have been weakened? For Tehran, that's not my personal view. I have a different view. But I want you to tell you, based on my reading of Iranian newspapers, their view is that Israel's position has been weakened. They keep talking about how Israeli population is tired. They keep talking about how Israel has been unable to completely defeat Hezbollah and Hamas. They also talk about the fact that there is internal conflict among different groups in Israel. And finally, as far as Iran is concerned, the United States position also is not as favorable for attacking Iran as it was before, for two reasons. A, there seems to be a growing conflict between NATO, EU countries, and Donald Trump, not only on economic issues, but on the very future of NATO. When a French president in Europe talks about providing nuclear umbrella, this is a new era, and Iranians can see that. But even more important than that, is the United States ready for a wide-scale war in the Middle East? President Trump has been able to re-win the elections because he has a very cohesive, organized, disciplined base of support. Part of that base of support consists of people who completely oppose any kind of military intervention in the Middle East. It is delusional to think that you can go ahead and bomb Iranian nuclear facilities and infrastructure and everything is going to be finished and the Iranian population is going to rise up and overthrow the Islamic Republic and a new regime is going to be there. That could be a good topic for a fictional book. It is not going to happen. And once Iran is attacked, as we learned from the Iran-Iraq experience, it's going to take for Iran a few months before it can organize itself, and then we are talking about a widespread war in the Middle East. My hope, my sincere hope, my personal hope is that we don't get there. I want the Islamic Republic to negotiate with the West. I have said it all along. It is a mistake for Iran to side with Russia and China. Iran should have a balanced foreign policy. That balanced foreign policy means yes to the West, yes to the East. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very comprehensive. Thank you. We all learned something in that. Just very briefly, before I go on to Sir John, so you sketched out the weakened, the wounded. You talked about a new era in the United States and their understanding. Do you think the IRGC accepts that they need a new strategy? We get reports now that they may be meddling in Syria again, trying to find allies in Syria. Do they accept that they no longer can use this, to use the phrase, their forward defense, and that they need a new strategy? Of course, that will lead us into discussions about, as many are commenting, that perhaps they will look to a nuclear weapon because the old, that sort of axis of resistance is not going to work in the same way. So briefly, do you think they accept that they have to move differently, or you seem to hint that actually they believe they can continue, galvanize it again?
I don't have access to their private discussion.
Yes.
I have
You
only.
can perhaps see through the lines
Yes.
when they're defiant statements.
I think publicly they say that this is going to continue. But they must be also delusional to think that that is going to continue. One of the reasons why they say revolutions don't happen is because revolutionaries, counter-revolutionaries, revolutionaries learn from their weaknesses and they can undermine people who want to overthrow them. Sign of a wise strategy is when you know it hasn't worked, you change it. Now, if I'm right that Iranian power is 50% of what it was, if they don't try to revise, it's going to be awful. In my book, I argued, written before the collapse of Syria, before the assassination of Hezbollah leader, Nasrallah, I said Iranian rise is unsustainable. Unsustainable. And I say the same thing. They need to revise it, not only in terms of their strategy, but they have to do two additional things. Number one, to come to terms with the United States about regional security issue. And number two, they should immediately try to push their non-state actor to disarm and get involved in the political process. That is better for those organizations, it is better for the Islamic Republic, and it is better for Iranian national interest.
Okay, thank you. So, Sir John, we have a sketch now of how the geopolitical map has shifted in dramatic ways. It was quite interesting that during these rising tensions in the Middle East, the start of direct hits between Iran and Israel, that the foreign minister, Araghchi, was visiting Arab capitals that the Iranians had not been able to visit for almost nearly 2 decades. And the diplomacy was absolutely unprecedented. But the old ways of doing things was still playing out on the ground. So enter President Trump in the White House, and he's basically made it clear he wants to talk. If not, he's threatening them. How do you see this moment now in terms of how the United States, there's people who support President Trump on this. He's made it clear that most of the people around him don't agree with him. They would like to strike Iran. So how do you see it going forward?
Well, thank you, Lise, for including me in this conversation. I must admit, let me just say, I came here with a degree of apprehension because Mohsen Milani and I hadn't met before, but I had reviewed his book in the Financial Times, and even though I criticised his book, he was very pleased to meet me. So I was relieved about that. But I do commend his book because it gives a very good understanding, not just of the Islamic regime, but what went on before it and some continuity between the two. So this moment that we have now that we're faced with. I think Professor Milani is right that Iran is weaker, but is not out. And I think he's also right that there are voices in the West, some in Washington, many in Jerusalem, who think that now is the opportunity to strike a mortal blow to Iran's nuclear program. And they may, those arguing that, they may be right that the Iranians are going ahead with with weaponization of their nuclear program. We don't actually know. I mean, I don't know because I'm not in office anymore. But I think this is a moment when the Iranian regime has to take some really quite fundamental decisions about its future. Its forward defense strategy is basically decimated. The Houthis in Yemen are not a replacement for Hezbollah's strike capability. And what's happened in Syria, I completely agree with you on this, Mohsen. The collapse of the Assad regime has removed that capacity for Iran to resupply and to keep Hezbollah going as a powerful military organization. They still have a political role in Lebanon, but they are not going to. They can have a great difficulty reconstituting their military power. So, what is this moment we're facing right now? There's no doubt that in European capitals there is a real desire for some form of negotiated way forward of the sort that we've already discussed. As Sanam was saying before we came here, there is a decision for the Europeans to make as to whether they reimpose sanctions on Iran, and that has to be taken in the next 6 months. That decision, and so they want the Iranians to cooperate on the nuclear program. Now, this is an active discussion at sort of senior official level. of the sort that I was involved with when I was political director in the Foreign Office back in 2003 to 2005, when we actually got quite close to negotiating a good deal, actually better than the JCPOA that the Americans negotiated in 2014, 2015. The focus, as you said, Lise, is on Washington and where President Trump is going to be. And I think you're right that President Trump's instinct is to cut a deal. Those of us who are following Ukraine as well as the Middle East are concerned about his concept of peace and what constitutes a fair outcome to a conflict, because the signs on Ukraine are not promising. He seems to think that peace equates with the absence of war, whereas as most of us who are involved in international affairs know, peace is goes much deeper than that, and you have to have a degree of stability, acceptance, grievances addressed, some transitional justice as well, if a peace is going to be in any way sustainable. I think when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Washington, they will have discussed Iran quite extensively. And it was at that press conference, of course, that Trump threw out his idea of a Gaza Riviera. I think that was a distraction for people like you, Lise, in the media, that they didn't want to expose the differences between Netanyahu and Trump on the main issue they were discussing, which was Iran. The media fell for it, and everybody went off on the Gaza route instead of focusing on a difference of approach. Netanyahu wanting to use American power to destroy the nuclear facilities, which Israel itself does not have the capacity to do. It can do a lot of damage on the surface, but it cannot get deep inside the bunkers where the nuclear facilities are hidden. So I think the Iranians know that they face some difficult decisions. I think Trump will seek a deal, but will try to hold open the idea of a nuclear strike against Iran. As we saw with his assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which I completely agree with Professor Milani again on this, that was a real turning point for Iran. He was the glue that held the regime together. He would be the person shaping the succession to Khamenei, and he would probably be the most powerful person in the country had he not been killed. So Trump is prepared to use violence against Iran. He may not think it through. But I think there is a binary choice for the Iranians. And of course, if Iran does go down the route of weaponization, the Mossad is sufficiently sophisticated and penetrative of the Iranian system that they will know about it. And then that would be the trigger for a military strike. But the exceptional negotiating skills of the Iranians up against the bluntness of President Trump is not an easy mix. It's not a good match. So I think there will be a lot of effort being put into these negotiations, but I wonder how far they will get.
Yes, because so far we've had slightly different responses to President Trump's letter, but I think would it be fair to say what the Foreign Minister actually said, that he sort of implied that they are ready, but not under maximum pressure. While the sanctions are in place, Iran will not talk.
But, yeah.
So the question is, he's so wedded to tariffs and sanctions, whether he would be able to lift, of course, it's such a complex web and it's a legal issue too, whether they can actually get to that point where there's enough lifting of the pressure so that they can actually...
I don't think we should take Iran at face value on this.
No?
In 2003, they were negotiating under some sanctions and the threat of war. In 2011, 12, 13, they were negotiating under sanctions, considerable sanctions, and then they got the relief after the deal was done. So I think what I was struck by was the Supreme Leader initially said, absolutely no way will we have negotiations with the Americans. And then he pulled back and said, we will not talk to the Americans under duress, I think was the English phrase that he would have used. I think they're adjusting their position. I think there have been messages back and forth through some Gulf countries to the Iranians saying it really is important that you negotiate with Washington. So I think we will see that going ahead. The dangerous line, a dangerous approach in my mind, is if the Iranians are too clever by half, which Iranians can be at times, I'm afraid, that they pursue both a negotiating route and a nuclear weaponization route at the same time, and seeing which one advances furthest. That is a dangerous route to go, and it's not impossible.
But the problem is that it is possible because you have one, perhaps it's the IRGC pursuing the nuclear route, and the diplomacy, the smiling face of Iranian diplomacy pursuing the other route, which is of course the divisions within Iran. Do you know, Sir John, after this, everyone here is going to go and read your review of Professor Milani's book, because so far you've agreed with everything. So we're thinking, well, what did he disagree with? He seems completely...
I'm sorry, don't encourage him to do that. Go on, buy the book.
I'm hoping now, just buy the book. Is it, I mean, I'm quite sure there's no firm answer to this question, but some people ask that according to the IAEA, Iran is almost within touching distance of weaponizing their nuclear power. They've not taken the step to go towards the building of the bomb. We still keep hearing that there's a fatwa of the Supreme Leader that he said no to nuclear weapons. Is that genuine? But for some, they must be saying, listen, we've come this far, we're not going back.
Can I just clarify the question? I don't think the IAEA are saying they're close to weaponization.
No,
what they're saying, they're close to having the nuclear material necessary for a bomb.
That's a very important distinction.
The weaponization is a separate process where we don't seem to have, where the IAEA is not actually directly engaged in that.
So the enrichment of it, the stockpiles they have, they're moving towards a point where they could. I mean, is it possible to say with any certainty, Professor Milani?
I don't know enough, but if you allow me, I want to add something to the point that John made about negotiations and why Iran has changed. Iran's position changed after President Trump's letter. I don't know what is in that letter. It has not been revealed. But what I have read here and there is that the U.S. is now talking about going beyond JCPOA. They want to go after Iranian missiles. They want to go after Iranian drones. And they want to put an end to Iranian support for the non-state actors. If Iran agrees to all of this...
It wouldn't, would it?
Then they might as well raise the white flag. There is nothing left of the Islamic Republic foreign policy at that time. So Ayatollah Khamenei has no choice but to say, no, I'm not going to agree with this. I'm not going to come and sign my surrender. And it has to change. Now, if we focus on the nuclear issue, I think there is a great deal of a good possibility for having an agreement. Don't forget, we have already, if the West is correct in its assessment, they can have it both ways. If they say Iran is completely weakened, then why do you want to negotiate Iran's regional activities? Why do you want to do that? Because they know Iran has not been weakened as much as it is said. And Iran's entire defense strategy, from the very beginning, in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war until today, has been based on missiles. It has not been based on nuclear program. Nuclear program is a bargaining chip that Iran uses. Its actual defense is on missiles, is on drones, and it's network in the Middle East. Now, one of those three pillars have been weakened. The other one, the missiles, we are told that it has been penetrated because Iran's defense system is weakened. But don't forget, the defense system that has been weakened are in the areas that are not critical to Iranian nuclear program. We don't know what kind of air defense system Iran has at its major nuclear programs.
Okay. Although Israel did get to that missile, that quite close to the... okay, I'm going to take some questions because as journalists, we always say the questions are just as interesting, if not more interesting than the answers. And I'm going to take through there's one here from Brinja Oscar-Dottir. And I'm going to give this one to you, Sana. I'm not going to go to you. I'm going to give you time to think about it. What constructive policy suggestions would you give to NATO or the European side of the NATO alliance on how to engage with Iran? What steps could the European allies make to mitigate threats emanating from Iran to Euro-Atlantic security? Thank you for an excellent panel. Thank you. Okay, Boone Patey, and then, okay, those are the two I cited. Okay, microphones, yes. And just to remind you, this is on the record today, not Chatham House.
William Patey, International Affairs Advisor, Control Risk, former ambassador to the region in Saudi Arabia, which is relevant to my question. What seems to have changed this time? When Trump opposed the JCPOA, it was ostensibly because it didn't deal with all the regional issues. Saudi Arabia was opposed to the JCPOA as well for similar reasons. Do you think there's been sufficient... Saudi Arabia now wants to avoid a war with Iran. They're focused on their own internal development. The absence of war is absolutely critical to their internal development. How much is the... and I'm looking to you for insight into the Trump White House here. How much is that maximalist position, you have to disarm, basically, as well as give up your nuclear weapons, is a starting position, the same way as John says we won't negotiate until you lift sanctions, is an Iranian starting position. And because it struck me, there's a real prospect here because of Iran having been weakened in Syria and in Lebanon, and I think even the Iraqi militias will have looked at that and have second thoughts. So some of the issues we were worried about Iran, its malign influence, have diminished. Regional allies have changed their position. Do you think a Trump administration could do a nuclear deal alone, or would want to do one for the avoidance of war, or are there enough hawks in the White House who say they expect them to reject the deal, and that's the excuse for war?
William, you know the answer to that. President Trump just wants his own deal. But there's a more complicated. Does anyone else have, and don't try to sneak in something to the moderator, does someone have a question similar to William Patey's that to add to the discussion? If you have a different one, just wait and hopefully I'll get to you. But if you have something similar, you can add it. No, everyone's shaking their head. Okay, this gentleman.
Michiel Remmers, a member of Chatham House. Of course, the nuclear issue is the key issue, but we also have a wholly unacceptable situation with disrupting global trade flows. We see drones being delivered to Russia. Surely that needs to be dealt with very seriously as well.
Yes, that's... Okay, Saddam, do you want to start on the...
Sure.
I know you're not an advisor, but Europe could play a role. If as Professor Villani says, they don't necessarily see the United States as strong as it used to be.
Sure. I mean, I think Europe, the countries known as the E3, which include the UK, France, and Germany, have long played a very important role in facilitating dialogue going back 20 years, trying to hold the deal together when President Trump withdrew in 2018, even trying to develop a mechanism to manage trade. Even today, the E3 and the EU do put Iran in lists of challenges that they're trying to address. The E3 have had a number of rounds of negotiations with the Iranians in order to perhaps address the issue of Iran's accelerating program. The Iranians are incentivized because they're looking to stop snapback sanctions from coming at the UN. So I imagine there will be continuous discussion to address the nuclear issue and perhaps try to deliver it to Washington. But that's coming in tandem with the direct dialogue that the president is trying to develop with Tehran. And over the past few days, we saw the Iranians meeting in Beijing with the Chinese and the Russians. So there does seem to be growing momentum, which is good. It's important to address this issue. This was always going to be the crisis year for Iran and its nuclear program. There is a bit of a race to the end, and it's unclear who's going to help deliver it. But this is part of President Trump's approach. He does want to see America's partners, adversaries, and allies burden share, and this is burden sharing. Everyone is rushing in to see what they can do. For Europe, I think this is a huge security issue, but obviously it factors below Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and broader defense and security challenges, and of course tariffs and the economy. So do they have the bandwidth, the momentum? Negotiations are going to have to be weekly until they get to the summer, where they've effectively said snapback could be very well invoked. I do think the president could jump over Europe and try to develop those ties directly or with Washington. And I would just quickly like to say that it's important to remember last time President Trump issued 12 demands on the Iranians. Obviously, not all of those demands are still on the table, and I don't think he's going to be doubling down on human rights in Iran, however much they need attention in 2025. But I think what we're really seeing is a public discussion and, of course, a private discussion on what will be discussed. The problem here is that if Iran is seeking long-term sanctions relief, the deal has to be tied to also something long-term on the nuclear file and bigger and better than the JCPOA. So how they cook what that looks like for long-term sanctions relief has to be balanced on the other side, and it could be a longer, stronger, more perpetual deal. And I think also, let me just add, Iran is seeking more than a nuclear negotiation, because in the past year, as Mohsen has said, not only have we seen a more weak Iran across the region, its power has certainly been diminished, and projection of power, the image of Iran's projection of power has been damaged. But Iran ultimately has been hit twice in 2024 in a very direct way by Israel. So I think part of this negotiation from Tehran's perspective is convincing or obtaining some degree of security guarantees from the United States, if not from the broader region, to hold back Israel. So there's a lot that can be on the table. How do you get there requires direct dialogue, and that's what the Supreme Leader continues to balk at. He doesn't want to sit down directly with Washington. He wants to have a lot of interlocutors managing that negotiation, dragging it along, which is what the Iranians are really good at doing.
Can you imagine what President Trump is going to say? He's got the Europeans coming now saying, Ukraine needs security guarantees. And then they come and they go, Iran needs security guarantees. He's going to wonder. Yes. No, that's what Saddam is saying, that's going to be part of the discussions. How to get inside the thinking?
Yes. I'm referring to the gentleman's question here. Iranian policy toward Yemen, toward the Houthis, in my judgment, has been the most successful, least expensive, and most productive aspect of its regional policies. Because Iran was always in competition with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was providing financial support to some exiled Iranian opposition groups, and Iranians decided to start supporting the Houthis after the Arab Spring. And it paid off. It paid off in the following way. Iran spent very little money. Iran has spent much more money in Iraq, considerably more in Lebanon, number one, even more than Syria. And then Syria, and of course Hamas, not much. But what happened? The Saudis finally concluded they can win the war, and they came to an agreement to sort of manage their conflict with Iran, because they know if there is a regional conflict and Saudi Arabia is a sort of an opponent of Iran, its oil facilities are going to be endangered. Regarding the nuclear talk, I think there is a great deal of mistrust between the U.S. and Iran. After all, it was the U.S. that got out of the JCPOA. It wasn't Iran. For good or bad, the fact that the Europeans haven't gotten out of the nuclear deal means the Europeans agree with Iran privately. Publicly, they can't because of President Trump. But privately, I don't think any of them would say it was Iran that got out. It was the UK, the US. So we need some confidence building. When two sides don't trust each other, you can't go and negotiate about everything. You start with those aspects that are possible to negotiate. Because there is a record, JCPOA. The Europeans agreed with it. Russia agreed with it, China agreed with it. Some kind of revival might make sense, because part of this deal could be if both Iran and the United States can be verified that they're going along with the new agreement, Then by the second year of the negotiations, we can start talking about other issues of concern to the West, including Iran's missile program, Iranian drones program. To be honest with you, I don't think any Iranian leader today would agree with the terms of starting open-ended negotiation with the US. To be honest with you, I don't think any other country that was in Iranian position would start that. So what we have to do is to start with things that can build confidence. And then based on that, we can go ahead and have other kinds of agreement. Also, one serious note, we keep talking about the ailing Ayatollah. Well, I'm pretty sure he has some problems. But next time, I want you to look at his speeches to see how he delivers his speech, and then draw your own conclusion about how sick he is.
Thank you. The question was, Sir John, it underlines that there's just so many threads to the relationship with Iran. Them, of course, they're looking to work to Russia because they have to look for allies in light of the sanctions. But it's a relevant point that they're worried about Iran now supplying Russia with the drones that they're using in Ukraine. So sanctions has all these knock-on effects.
Well, I think there are some discards for Iran here. They don't have to supply Russia with drones, especially now the Russians are exercising the muscle. They're not being pushed back in Ukraine now. They're not in a bad shape. So that's something they can discard. There's also some areas of common ground between Washington and Tehran. For example, on oil. It's not that the Americans want the Iranians now to export oil, but part of the American strategy is to reduce the price of oil. And to do that, having Iranian crude back on the global markets will have an impact there. And so there's an area where Trump can make some concessions as well. So there's space in here for negotiation. One thing that's not really come up, at least so far, is we've talked about Iran as sort of a unitary actor in the region. Whereas I think what we have to keep in mind that the single most important thing for the Iranian regime is to stay in power.
Yes.
And that requires stability. Like Professor Milani, I don't know when this transition is going to take place. Khamenei has on a number of occasions said he's visiting a place probably for the last time, but he keeps on going back there again. So we don't know how ill he is. We don't know whether it'll be 2 years or 5 years, but it's going to be somewhere soon. And there's no obvious successor to Khamenei apart from his son. And how do you have a revolutionary movement which turns into a dynasty? And there's real problems the Iranians have got with the transition. They need a period of stability, and I think. Whilst the hardliners in the system will be saying we ought to weaponize our nuclear capability now because we're really exposed, I think Khamenei himself has always held back from that, and I don't see him changing that approach in the last couple of years. We will see. We don't know. I think he will not want to go down in history as the last supreme leader of Iran. He will want there to be a transition that requires stability in the region, which means there is some scope in here for the Americans to disappoint Israel and go ahead with the deal. And as we all know, the Americans are not great negotiators. Once they get into a negotiation, they make far more concessions than is usually necessary. That's a sort of tradition of America, which we saw in the JCPOA, which was a much weaker deal than the one we would have had we followed through in 2005, 2006. But that's the reality of it. But we shouldn't lose sight that of regime stability being the single most important thing for the Iranians.
Yes, absolutely.
And then that would open up, of course, if there was a deal, it would open up the idea of a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement, and that's Trump's route to being a peacemaker in the region.
Yes, okay. We have 10 minutes left. I'm going to, again, take one question from here and then 2 questions. I've had some from this side. We'll go to this side. Professor Milan, there's going to be a question for you, and it's from Zara Sior, and she says the question's for you because she says she's a big fan. I don't know whether she's read the book, but she's a big fan. She asked a number of questions, and some of them have been answered already. So I'll just take her last one. It's sort of implicit in our discussion. She's really questioning, has the window for meaningful negotiations with Iran with the US and its allies effectively closed because of Iran's economy in crisis and sanctions, the whole situation, if you want to think about this. So I'm going to cast my eyes to this. Where's the women in the room? Okay, this gentleman here. Huh? They're on the podium. Okay, so this one, and then the gentleman with the lovely mustache. 20 men sort of put up their hand. Okay, with the man with the glasses, yes.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Apostolou. I'm a member and a student at SOAS. Iran's regional role has historically been shaped by its unique position as a nation without natural allies, compelling it to forge strategic partnerships based on mutual interests. However, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias are often labeled proxies of Tehran in popular discourse, a term that oversimplifies these dynamics. So my question is, to what extent does this framing distort the reality of these alliances? And, by portraying Iran as a monolithic reactionary actor, does this proxy language hinder the potential for meaningful diplomacy?
Very good. And that's especially a point with Yemen, which people sometimes confuse. The gentleman, yes.
Good evening. My name is Ihsan Kadir. I'm the General Secretary of the League of Kurdistan Regions. My question is this: can Iran be trusted? Iran had a window of opportunity to prove itself when America withdrew from the nuclear agreement. Iran has used that position to work on its nuclear weapon program, and also Iran has used that time to extend its work with its proxies in the region. Now Syria has gone, Hezbollah is weakened, Hamas is in a very weakened position, and in Iraq there are lots of difficulties there. Can Iran be believed that it can continue and be a responsible player? And also remember, there are lots of troubles within Iran as well. Lots of people, Iranian communities, Kurds, Azerbaijanis, they are very upset. They're not happy at all. Just 2-3 days ago, Iranian president was told by an official of IRGC not to recite that poetry in Turkish in public.
Thank you. It's a very important point. Saddam, can Iran be trusted?
Trust but verify was the whole point of the JCPOA. So it depends on the contours of the deal. I think the Iranians would say they complied by the deal and it was verified by the IAEA 14 times. And then they adhered to the JCPOA for 12 months before they began what became known as their maximum resistance strategy, which was to take resistance to the countries that supported the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. And in 2019, we saw attacks on tankers in the Persian Gulf, on Abqaiq and Khurais in Saudi Arabia, and so on and so on. Leopards don't change their spots, however. It's important to remember that the Islamic Republic is 46 years old and has defined its strategic loneliness and its defense posture and its deterrence based on its own experience, as well as its old worldview. So I think that there will certainly be a lot of challenges on regional states as well as the international community, if there still is one, to monitor and verify whatever comes next if a deal is reached with Iran. And there are certainly incentives there. The Iranian economy is devastated, and for the system in Iran to think about a third republic, a next supreme leader, to think about the future, it is certainly tied to sanctions relief, and that I think is important to consider. And more broadly, Iran has regional challenges. Just quickly on the dynamics with the proxies, yes, you're quite right, they're not quite proxies. And the relationship with the axis of resistance has been, I think, portrayed in a very reductive manner that doesn't reflect the agency of the groups themselves in maintaining that relationship. And Iran has gone through various itinerations in building up the relations with Hezbollah, with the Houthis and the like. So certainly as we go and look into the future of Iran's dynamics with the axis of resistance, there will be another shift and a response. It shifted after the shock of Qasem Soleimani's death. It became much more horizontal. Iran tried to less directly manage the groups. And today, I think Iran will be certainly looking to recalibrate, to keep Hezbollah alive, to keep the Houthis there. And to a certain degree, they are already political actors in all of the spheres that they operate, Mohsen. So showing the resilience of the resistance axis is important, I would say, also for Iran's economy, because it's through the resistance axis that Iran has become actually more embedded in the region and been able to overcome some of its own psychology of strategic loneliness. Iran today relies on its neighbors more than it ever has done to survive sanctions. And that doesn't just include Iraq or its countries on the borders, but also the Gulf states as well are complicit in helping the Islamic Republic and perhaps using that in order to manage ties as well.
Okay. Do you pursue a realistic pathway? I mean, the sanctions are so complicated, such a web of them. Is there a realistic pathway to negotiations to see the sanctions being lifted?
Completely lifting? No, because some of these sanctions are imposed by U.S. Congress. And it is very unlikely that the U.S. Congress, based on the composition that I see today, are going to lift it. Even if they want to lift it, it's going to take a long while. But that is not that important. What is important, if they can lift some of the sanctions and allow even other countries to start investing in Iran, that is going to do the job. But the point I want to make about Iran is that let's not make exception to the case of Iran when it comes to its foreign policy. Every single country I know of, and I teach international relations, I have studied history of international relations. Every single country's foreign policy is based on what I call PSI, seeking power, seeking security, and protecting interest. Survival is, of course, can you think of a single regime that says, I don't want to survive? I just want to quit. No, it does. That's why we have war. So Iran is no exception to that. Regarding the question on my fan, whoever she is, my dear friend, please understand, and I'm looking at the camera, please understand we have no choice. Diplomacy is the art of making the impossible possible. Look at the history of the Middle East in the past 20 years. The war in Iraq, devastating consequences for the Iraqis. Look at Syria, a devastated country. Look at Libya. Look at Lebanon. Iran does not want to go through that kind of conflict, that kind of war. And therefore, Iran and its leadership must go out of its way to seek a diplomatic solution to this. And finally, regarding the question that a young man asked, of the three that you mentioned, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, the only one that comes close to being a proxy is Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was created with Iranian support right after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in June of 1982. And Iran has been supporting it financially, logistically. Hamas is not an Iranian proxy. In fact, I submit to you, Hamas has been the single greatest trouble for Iran in the past few decades. And it has shown repeatedly that its interest supersedes the interest of the Islamic Republic. They moved their headquarters when the civil war started in Syria. And it was Qasem Soleimani who tried to have reconciliation. And the Houthis, they were formed without Iranian support. Yes, the founder of the Houthis traveled to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, went to Syria, and from there got a visa, went to Iran. But there is no evidence he met with Ayatollah Khomeini. There is no evidence he talked to the IRGC. The IRGC helped them. But the Houthis has a long history of a struggle, and Iran provided support to them mostly after the beginning of the Arab Spring. And I know John is going to disagree with me.
So we have one last punchy word from Sir John.
Well, it's been a fascinating panel, and I've learned a lot this evening as well. I think there are three roads ahead, and we don't know which one's going to be taken, but I would hazard a guess that there's a sunlit uplands approach, where a sunlit uplands approach, where our outcome, where Iran and the United States reach an agreement, sanctions are lifted, Iranian oil is exported again, the nuclear program comes to an end. I would judge that as no more than 10%. There's a downward spiral outcome where the Iranians frustrate the Americans so much that the Americans and the Israelis get together and launch a strike against Iran with bad repercussions in the Gulf and across the region. And I would say that is more likely, but still unlikely. I would put that at 25 to 30%. And there's a muddle-through approach, which is basically what we've done for the last 20 years with Iran. As Iran goes through its own internal processes of change, as America comes to terms with the reality that actually the simplistic approach of President Trump is not actually viable. And I think the muddle-through strategy is likely to be at least 60% of the likelihood of where we go forward. But we are at a decisive moment. I don't rule out either the 10% or the 30%, because they are a real big upside and a really dangerous downside. But I suspect what we'll end up with is a muddle-through.
Let's get a sense I want you to have the last word. With a show of hands, how many in this audience believes that there's a realistic possibility of some kind of deal being struck between President Trump's administration and whatever other countries join in and the Islamic Republic of Iran? How many people believe that's possible in the next 4 years? Possible. A deal is possible. And how many people believe that it just is not on the horizon? Okay. I have to ask, how many are going to be on the sunlit upland? Sunlit. Who's on the anyone on the sunlit?
So most people have no opinion.
You've honored all of us and informed all of us and entertained all of us. Thank you very, very much. There's a lot more that we could have discussed. I'm so sorry for those that I couldn't take your questions, and thank you to those of you who joined us online. There was also some very good questions. I know Chatham House will continue to organize panels like this to continue this discussion. You may be able to catch our great panelists after we finish this formal part of it, but please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.